Winter arrived so early and so cruelly that it seemed like an enraged entity. The snow didn't fall, plummeted, pushed by the wind like sharp blades. The German soldiers, who had been marching exhausted since the end of autumn, began to feel the weight of that bone-chilling cold. Their boots stiffened, their fingers went numb, and with each breath a white cloud reminded them that the air itself was freezing. In this almost unreal scenario, the Red Army began to Operation Winter Storm, a name that did justice to the brutality that lay ahead. The Soviets advanced like an endless red wave, pushing back exhausted, wounded, and starving German units. The retreat turned to despair. Trucks got stuck in the deep snow, horses froze to death on the roads, and weapons jammed amidst increasingly chaotic gunfire. The German front, which months earlier had been advancing confidently towards Moscow, now crumbled. It was as if a rug was being pulled out from under their feet. Entire companies disappeared into the icy fog, isolated, cut off by Soviet attacks or simply swallowed by winter. Communication collapsed, radios failed, and no one knew for sure where friendly lines were, or if they still existed. And it was in this chaos, in this silent and cold collapse, that a small dot emerged on the map. Kolm, until then, it was just a forgotten village on the banks of the Lovat River, with wooden houses and narrow streets. Nothing that attracted attention. But as Soviet forces closed in on several sectors, that village began to shine on the map as the last possible space for the Germans to create a point of resistance. Kholm suddenly became vital, not because it had resources, but precisely because it had nothing. It was the last solid ground, the last refuge before the Red Army swallowed the entire region. The city became an improvised port in the midst of a storm that threatened to sink everything. The Germans, who were still able to maintain order, were rushed there. Some arrived, staggering, their faces burned by the cold. Others carried wounded men on their backs, and everyone knew that if they didn't cling to that piece of frozen land, they would be swept away by the war without leaving a trace. Kolm wasn't surrounded yet, but with each passing hour, the red shadows in the snow drew closer. Winter had broken through the front, and now the battle for survival would begin there. When the last survivors of the retreat finally reached Kolm, they immediately realized they weren't arriving at a shelter, but rather at a dead end. The village seemed smaller than it appeared on the maps. Burnt houses, narrow streets covered in dirty snow, and a heavy silence broken only by the distant roar of Soviet artillery. There, pieces of what were once complete units were joined together. There was no organized army arriving. There was company remnants, fragments of battalions, men who had lost their commanders, their weapons, or their morale. Among them were military, policemen, artillerymen without cannons, infantry soldiers, radio operators, cooks, drivers, messengers, exhausted doctors, nurses shivering with cold, and even groups of volunteers who simply clung to whoever still seemed to know what to do. They were all gathered under the command of a man who would soon become a legend in that white hell, General Theodor Scherer. Scherer wasn't the type to give grand speeches, but his presence commanded something those desperate men needed: an axis, a center of gravity to lean on before sinking completely. He observed his 5,500 men, if they could even be called a military force. Many were starving, coughing up blood. Others limped with their feet wrapped in rags because their boots had been destroyed by the ice. Still, they had arrived, and now they were the only barrier between the Soviet advance and the total collapse of that part of the front. Engineers began transforming houses into makeshift fortresses. Soldiers dug trenches with their bare hands when their shovels broke on the frozen ground. Machine guns were placed in attics. Basements became emergency shelters. Every corner, every piece of wall, every window was prepared to become a point of resistance. Meanwhile, Scherer was organizing what he would call Kolm Siege Group. He knew he wouldn't receive reinforcements by land anytime soon, if at all. He also knew that the Red Army was approaching like a red storm, and that once they closed the encirclement, there would be no way Out, at night, around campfires hidden within the rubble, the men spoke softly. Some prayed, others sharpened bayonets, knowing that soon they would have to use their weapons at close range, very close. There was the smell of burnt oil, of wet clothes, of fear, and of snow. And then, between one distant rumble and another, a growing truth became apparent. Those 5,500 men were alone, completely alone. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to be tested like few units have ever been tested in history, and many of them would never see the thaw of spring. Kolm was about to be swallowed up, and its defenders could already feel the noose closing in like cold claws around its throat. The first signs that the encirclement was about to close appeared like shadows in the snow. German patrols stumbled back, breathless, saying they had seen Soviet columns emerging from the frozen forests. They marched silently, as if winter itself had created them. It was the prelude to something great and fatal. Then, on a dawn that seemed darker than the others, the crackling sounds began. They weren't bursts of machine gun fire, not yet. They were small, dry explosions, as if the forest were coughing up fire. The Soviets had begun cutting off all the roads. Every trail leading out of Kholm was taken, every bridge blew up, every route of retreat simply vanished under the control of the Red Infantry. Shearer's men tried to break through in two directions, but were stopped by human walls, supported by mortars and heavy machine guns buried in the snow. Within a few hours, the reality became clear. There was nowhere left to run. To the east, Soviet columns gathered in the white fields, preparing to tighten the encirclement. To the north, troops advanced house by house, driving out small German groups that attempted to hold advanced positions. To the south, the Lovat River, frozen, rigid as stone, became an attack route for enemy divisions that marched across the ice as if it were solid ground. And in the west, the last clear path was closed by an artillery attack so intense that the trees broke like matches. Kolm was surrounded on all sides. The news hit the defenders like a huge weight. Some stared at the ground, others clenched their teeth. But no one dared to say aloud what everyone was thinking. We're trapped, and we're going to die here. The Soviets, now in complete control of the encirclement ring, began bombarding the city. The first projectiles fell on the edges of Kolm, raising columns of snow and frozen earth. Then came others, closer by, and others, until the explosions began to shake the walls of the houses where soldiers were trying to take shelter. The entire village trembled, as if it were being swallowed by an invisible giant. In the streets, men ran carrying boxes of ammunition. Others dragged wounded men with no time to cry or think. Shouts mingled with the deafening sound of explosions. The sky, which should have been a pale white, turned into a thick grey cloud. Kolm was no longer a village. It was a trap of snow, blood, and smoke, and it was at that moment, exactly when the siege closed in like metallic teeth around the city, that all the men there, all of them, understood the magnitude of the hell that was only beginning. The enemy was everywhere. The snow was now the first battlefield. The silence that followed the closing of the siege brought no relief. It was a heavy, uneasy silence, as if the snow itself were holding its breath. The defenders of Kolm knew that this was only the calm before the storm, and the storm arrived so quickly and violently that many didn't even have time to react. Before dawn, the sentinels on the edges of the village heard a muffled noise coming from the distant trees. Footsteps, hundreds of them, crunching the snow with a steady rhythm. Soon after, a whistle cut through the frigid air, and then they came. The red tide emerged like a cursed ghost. Entire rows of Soviet soldiers, running through the snow, some shouting, others silent, advancing with bayonets gleaming in the grey light of dawn. Their speed was terrifying. It seemed impossible to move so fast in that cold. German machine guns opened fire, spitting orange flames against the endless white. The impact was brutal. Bodies fell. The snow exploded into clouds of ice and blood. But for every man who fell, 3 others advanced right behind, determined to break the German line at any cost. And it was costly. Kolm's advanced positions were swallowed up in minutes. German soldiers were pushed back, fighting from house to house, jumping through broken windows, trying not to freeze or be pierced by bayonets. The war has become personal, corporal, bloody. Inside small wooden sheds, shots rang out at point-blank range. Men clashed on the slippery floor, plumes of smoke billowing from the cold barrels of rifles that had already fired more than they should have. It was a type of fight where every meter was conquered with frozen sweat, pain, and desperate courage. And the village trembled. Walls cracked from grenade impacts. Roofs collapsed on soldiers trying to take cover. Children and civilians who had remained there were dragged into makeshift basements trying to protect themselves, while the world above turned into a chaotic mess of gunfire, screams, and snow-stained red. General Scherer ran between the positions, encouraging, reorganizing, dragging wounded soldiers by the collars into destroyed houses while shouting orders. He knew that if the Soviets managed to take the center of the village that day, it would all end right there. But the defenders resisted, even exhausted, even when frozen. Even though I'm scared. And as the sun slowly rose, as if afraid to illuminate that horror, the red tide finally lost its strength. The Soviets retreated to reorganize into new formations, leaving behind dozens of bodies scattered in the snow. It was only the first attack, the first hunt. But the men in Kolm already knew that this had only been a warning. The siege had officially begun, and the village would be tested to its human limits. Ice becomes an enemy. Temperature drops to 40 degrees C. When the first Soviet attack finally ceased, many defenders breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that for a few hours they would have peace. But what came next was worse than any grenade, worse than any burst of machine gun fire: absolute cold. That night, the thermometer plummeted so fast it seemed to have fallen off a cliff. It reached 40 degrees. The temperature was so brutal that even the air seemed solid. When a soldier spoke, his voice turned to vapor that froze on his mustache. When he took a deep breath, he felt his chest burn as if he were burning ice. The weapons were jamming. Lubricants froze inside the bolts. The metal bands were beloved. Some soldiers made the mistake of touching their rifles with their bare hands. That was enough to leave bits of skin stuck there. The blood froze before it even dripped. The snow, which had previously served as camouflage or an obstacle, was now the enemy. It buried boots, stiffened clothing, and transformed corners of the village into white traps. Soldiers stumbled and fell, and some simply couldn't get up. It was common for patrolmen to find a comrade lying against a wall, seemingly resting, but upon closer inspection, they would realize he had been dead for hours, frozen in silence, with the tranquil expression of someone who had given up fighting the cold. The enemy was everywhere now. The tents had hardened like stone. The makeshift shelters had holes through which the wind blew like a thin blade. Soldiers slept huddled together, not to keep warm, but to try not to die before dawn. Even so, many were found trembling, delirious, with purple fingertips and white feet, the beginning of gangrene. And then came the real terror, the wounded, men with broken legs, severed arms, punctured lungs. All suffered not only from the pain, but from the cold that ripped the life from them inch by inch. Doctors struggled with instruments that froze in their hands. The bandages hardened. The blood turned into dark crystals. Some were shouting for more blankets. Others were begging for the mercy shot to come soon. No one was prepared for that kind of suffering. Meanwhile, the Soviets, well equipped for winter, watched from afar, knowing they didn't need to attack every day. They only had to wait. They only had to let winter do some of the dirty work. At that moment, Scherer's men understood that they were fighting against two fences: a visible, armed, ferocious force, the Red Army, and another invisible, silent, relentless one, the Russian winter. The cold began to devour men, courage, ammunition, and hope. And ironically, there was no way to fight against it. It was a battle that no military manual taught you how to win, and it was only the beginning. The ruins of Kolm, houses become frozen tombs with the siege. Firmly closed and the cold breaking men like dry branches, the village of Kholm began to die little by little. It wasn't a quick event, not a single explosion. It was a slow, painful, almost cruel process. The city itself has become an enemy. The wooden houses, once simple peasant dwellings, could not withstand the continuous bombardment. Each day, another row of roofs collapsed. Another wall gave way. Another room opened up in splinters of wood, scattering shards frozen in the snow. Inside those destroyed houses, men took shelter, trying to rest for a few minutes. But often that roof, which still seemed safe, was just a fragile skeleton. A grenade, a poorly aimed burst of machine gun fire, or even the weight of accumulated snow, and the roof would collapse. Some soldiers were buried alive, others died crushed, others froze, trapped under the rubble because there was simply no one strong enough left to pull them out. Kolm has become a wooden cemetery. Broken windows were like empty eyes, staring at misfortune. The basements became involuntary torture chambers, where the wounded groaned and begged for a bit of warmth. The wind surged through the cracks, making the interiors of the houses seem like icy caves, where the cold accumulated as if it had a will of its own. Even the places where soldiers gathered, makeshift kitchens, canteens, shelters, became dangerous. A single artillery shot could turn a rare meal into instant carnage. The streets disappeared under layers of trampled snow. Now they were confusing trails, marked by dark stains of blood that froze almost instantly. There were spots where the snow was so hard and tinged with red that it looked like marble, a war marble. The civilians who still lived in the village also suffered. Entire families huddled in basements with wounded soldiers, sharing the little warm air and the same darkness. Children's cries were muffled by the explosions, and often the soldiers themselves pleaded for silence as the sound attracted enemy fire. And the worst part was that there was nowhere to go. Every corner was a trap. Each abandoned house was a potential tomb. Every shadow could have hidden a Soviet sniper. At a certain point, Shera realized that Kolm was no longer a village. It was a broken cocoon, an urban skeleton where men lived like ghosts, moving among ruins, surviving by instinct, fighting not to succumb to the cold or to despair. And even so, they kept fighting, because within that carcass of a dead city, a single thought still pulsed. If Kolm falls, we will all disappear. The early morning of January 26, 1942, dawned with a pale, sickly light, filtered through a fog so dense it looked like frozen milk spilled over the world. The thermometer, when anyone bothered to look, read -42 degrees Celsius, a temperature at which the metal of rifles clung to exposed skin, at which urine froze before touching the ground, at which lungs burned with each breath as if inhaling shards of glass. Kolm, that Russian village of only a few thousand inhabitants before the war, now housed some 5,500 men of the Wehrmacht, remnants of divisions shattered in the Soviet winter offensive, mixed with engineers, gunners, and even cooks who had taken up arms. For weeks, the Germans had managed to keep a thin artery open to the west, a snow-packed trail that supply trucks still risked crossing under fire. But on the night of the 25th to the 26th, everything changed. The Soviet Third Shock Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Maxim Pukayev, and elements of the 33rd Army and the 188th Rifle Division, received direct orders from Moscow, closed the ring around that German pocket, which, against all expectations, was still resisting. Siberian troops, hardened by the cold that killed Germans in minutes, moved silently through the frost-covered pine forests. Skiers from the 1st Shock Corps glided like white ghosts. Local partisans who knew every ravine and every frozen swamp guided the battalions. At 4:17 a.m., the last bridge over the Lovat River, a wooden structure that German engineers had reinforced with frozen logs and sandbags, exploded in an orange fireball. A Soviet assault group, led by a Siberian captain carrying only a Tokarev pistol and grenades, crawled across the icy river beneath the fog and placed TNT charges on the main beams. As the bridge collapsed, the roar echoed for miles, waking the defenders of Kolm like a final judgment thunderclap. Within minutes, the last German outposts to the north and east were taken. A company of the 123rd Infantry Division, guarding the road to Staraya Russa, was surprised while still sleeping in its shelters. The Soviets entered with knives and rifle butts so as not to alert the rest of the pocket. When the sun finally managed to break through the fog around 10 a.m., the Germans saw red flags waving where their own sentries had previously stood. Inside the city, Major General Franz Schirmer, the Lion of Kholm, as the men already called him, gathered his officers in a cellar that reeked of dried blood and kerosene. The map on the wall, stained with frozen coffee, now showed a perfect circle of red lines around the name Kolm. Schirmer, a 52-year-old Prussian with a wind-burnt face and a scar running from his temple to his chin, spoke in a hoarse voice. "Gentlemen, from this moment on, we are officially surrounded. No trucks will enter, no planes will be able to land while the Yak fighters dominate the sky. But know this, as long as one of us breathes, Kolm will not fall." The entire city seemed to shrink. The streets, once mere ruins, were now the entire universe of those men. The wooden houses, their walls shattered by previous projectiles, were transformed into fortresses. Doors were torn off to serve as shields. Iron beds became barricades. The deep, damp cellars became hospitals, warehouses, and makeshift tombs. Every window was an arrow slit. Every destroyed roof, an observation post. The soldiers began marking the walls with charcoal. "Hier stand ein tapferer Deutscher," here stood a brave German, phrases that would be found months later by the Soviets when they finally entered. Outside, the Red Army positioned its weapons like a giant trap. Batteries of 152mm howitzers were dragged by Stalinets tractors through the deep snow. The dreaded Katyushas, Stalin's organs, were camouflaged in clearings, their tracks pointing toward the small dot on the map that was Kolm. Assault. Troops were ordered not to take prisoners in the first waves. German resistance had already cost too much. At 5 p.m. on the 26th, the siege was complete. The last German radio picked up a message from Army Group North headquarters. "Kolm must resist at all costs. Help will come." But on Soviet frequencies, intercepted by operators who could barely keep their frozen earpieces in, laughter and curt orders could be heard. "Unichtojit fascistskuyu gadinu v Kolm." Destroy the fascist viper in Kolm. That night, no one slept. The men huddled together in the holds to share the little warmth their bodies had. Some prayed, others wrote letters that would never be sent. A young Westphalian lieutenant, his feet already black with gangrene, asked a comrade that if he survived, he should tell his mother that he had died a soldier. The comrade promised. Neither of them would survive the month of February. Kolm was now an island of ice, blood, and steel, surrounded by a red ocean that only grew larger. January 27th, 1942. The day hadn't even truly dawned. The sky remained a leaden grey shroud, so low it seemed to touch the destroyed rooftops. At 5:48 a.m., hell began. 100 cannons opened fire simultaneously. 122 mm and 152 mm howitzers, 120 mm mortars, 76.2 mm anti-tank guns converted to direct fire, all converged on an area of less than 2 square kilometers. The ground in Kolm literally jumped. Houses that had miraculously remained standing collapsed like houses of cards. The bell of the Orthodox Church, which still hung crookedly in the half-destroyed tower, rang on its own with the vibrations, a mournful sound that the Germans came to call the death bell. For 47 uninterrupted minutes, the city was wiped off the map. When the bombing stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. In the ears of the survivors, only an eternal whistle buzzed. Then came the infantry. From the forest to the north emerged the 1st Battalions of the 391st Siberian Rifle Division, men from Yakutia and Buryatia, in white padded coats, faces burned by the cold, shouting "Za Rodinu, za Stalina," as if the words were bullets. Behind them came the penal companies, convicts released to the front with the promise of redemption in blood. They advanced without cover, in dense lines, like in the manuals of 1914. The Germans expected exactly that. In the makeshift trenches made of frozen corpses and wreckage, the MG-34s opened fire. The sound was a continuous roar, like fabric being torn at high speed. The first Siberians fell in droves, the snow turning a vivid red in almost artistic patterns, but more came after them, and more. In some sectors, the fighting became hand-to-hand in less than 10 minutes. A sergeant from the 8th Sapper Company, named Hans Küpper, fought with a trench shovel after his MP-40 jammed in the cold. He cracked the skulls of 3 attackers before a Soviet bayonet pierced his neck. His body hung on the barricade for hours, still, clutching the bloodied shovel, an image that would go down in the legends of the pocket. In the southern sector, near the frozen Lovat River, an entire company of the 218th Infantry Regiment was decimated when Soviet hand grenades turned their hold into a tomb. The survivors crawled out through the rubble, their uniforms ablaze, firing pistols as they ran. Only 8 returned to the German lines. At 11:20 a.m., after 5 hours of uninterrupted combat, the attack began to lose momentum. The Soviets had managed to advance only 200 to 300 meters in some places, paying with rivers of blood. Piles of bodies reached chest height. On one stretch of the main street, the Germans used frozen corpses as additional sandbags, a sight that would make even First World War veterans vomit. When the last Soviet retreated, leaving behind more than 1,000 dead that morning alone, the Germans did not celebrate. They did not have the strength for it. The wounded were so numerous that the doctors began to make terrible choices. A young doctor from Munich, Lieutenant Dr. Ernst Kleist, amputated legs and arms with a frozen meat saw, without anesthesia, while the patients bit down on pieces of leather to avoid screaming. The morphine had run out in the first week of the siege. The only anesthetic was a blow to the head with the butt of a rifle before the saw went in. Late in the afternoon, Major Schirmer walked along the lines, his coat torn, his face covered in soot and blood that wasn't his own. He stopped before a group of soldiers trying to warm their hands over a candle made of corpse fat. Today they tested it. Tomorrow they'll come for real. And everyone knew he was right, because on the horizon, through the returning fog, it was possible to see new battalions taking up positions. T-34 tanks were being brought in along trails through the forest. More Katyushas were being assembled, and in the intercepted Soviet transmissions, a phrase was repeated like a mantra. Kolm would die in February. The Germans looked at the darkening sky and knew the real battle hadn't even begun yet. And yet, in those frozen ruins, in those faces burned by cold and horror, something still shone that neither the Russian winter nor the Red Army could extinguish. They were still fighting. The ring closes. Kholm goes into total isolation. January 28th, 1942. The third day after the siege was completed, when the sun finally manages to pierce the layer of low clouds around 10:30 a.m., it brings no warmth, only a cruel white light that makes the snow reflect like a knife's blade. From atop what remains of the bell tower of St. Nicholas Church, Lieutenant Karl Weber, an artillery observer with eyes already red from sleepless nights, adjusts his binoculars and feels his stomach sink. The entire forest is moving. It's no exaggeration. In every direction, every 500 or 600 meters, new Soviet outposts spring up. Small groups of soldiers in white camouflage drag Maxim machine guns on. Sleds, skinny horses pull field kitchens. Columns of skiers leave perfect parallel tracks in the virgin snow. Red flags are planted at high points, as if marking conquered territory. Weber counts more than 120 new campfires in the northern sector alone. Each campfire signifies a platoon, sometimes an entire company. At 11:07 a.m., the radio crackles for the last time with a human voice from the rear. Kolm, surrounded on all sides. Hold on, the Luftwaffe will attempt air refueling. A courage. After that, only static. The external antenna had been ripped off by shrapnel the previous night, and now the only receiver that was still working was almost out of battery. The operator, a 19-year-old cableman from Stuttgart, takes his headphones off and looks at his comrades as if he has just heard their death sentence. Inside the city, Major General Schirmer calls a meeting in the basement of the old Soviet school. The room is lit by 2 tallow candles that reek of burnt grease. On the table, a torn map stained with blood. Schirmer draws the new perimeter with a red pencil. Now it's only 1,800 meters from east to west and 1,200 meters from north to south, an area smaller than many football fields. Gentlemen, we have ammunition for perhaps 15 days of intense combat. Food for 35 days if we halve the rations. Firewood for 8 days. Water only from melting snow. From today onwards, every bullet, every crumb, every log is accounted for. Any civilian who tries to flee will be shot on the spot, not out of cruelty, but because we cannot risk them revealing our positions. Outside the basement, reality is already knocking at the door. The Russian civilians who couldn't escape before the siege, some 800 souls, including old people, women and children, are now a dead weight. Starving, they crowd the streets begging for bread. A group of 10 tries to cross the lines at dusk, carrying icons and bundles. They are met by a burst of machine gun fire from a Soviet nest 300 meters away. 5 fall immediately. The others run back, dragging bodies. A woman of about 40, her shawl bloodied, falls to her knees before an 18-year-old German sentry and pleads in Russian mixed with German, "Don't kill children, hunger." The boy, who had never killed anyone before the war, turns his face away and cries with his rifle still pointed at him. Food is immediately rationed to survival levels. 150 grams of stale bread per day for soldiers. Half that for civilians. 1 can of canned meat for every 7 men. A tablespoon of sugar when available. Horses killed in the streets are slaughtered on the spot. The meat is cut while still hot because within minutes it becomes as hard as stone. The smell of frozen horse blood becomes part of the air in Kolm. The water is another hell. The wells are frozen 2 meters deep. Soldiers line up with buckets and pans to melt snow on makeshift stoves made from gasoline cans cut in half. The snow, dirty with soot and pieces of plaster from the destroyed houses, produces a grey water that causes immediate diarrhea. But that's all there is. At night, the temperature drops to -45 degrees. The men sleep with their helmets on, their rifles between their legs to prevent the bolt from freezing open. Those who take off their boots wake up with swollen black feet, the beginning of gangrene. A Feldwebel from Westphalia cuts off his own toes with wire scissors because he could no longer feel them, and the artillery begins its slow work of demolition. These are no more massive bombing raids. Those will come later. Now it's just adjustment fire, a mortar here, a shell there, always at unpredictable times. At 2:22 p.m., a 152mm projectile falls exactly on the market square where a group of soldiers was trying to heat soup. 8 men are literally wiped out. Only pieces of their uniforms remain, stuck in the snow. At 6:47 p.m., another shot hits the makeshift ammunition depot in a basement. The explosion illuminates the night for seconds, and the roar causes 3 more houses to collapse. When darkness finally falls, Kolm looks like a ship sinking in slow motion. No lights on, strict order, only the red glow of embers in the stoves and in the distance, the circle of Soviet bonfires that now shine like a necklace of fire around the city's neck. A young soldier writes in his diary, his handwriting trembling because his pen is frozen. Day 3 of the siege. Today I understood what it means. To be truly alone. There is no back, there is no front. There is only Kolm, and Kolm is dying. The first nights of terror. The enemy does not sleep. The first night of the full siege begins at 3:40 p.m. The sun simply gives up and disappears behind the pine-covered hills. The darkness that falls is so absolute that the men inside the holds cannot see their own hands in front of their faces. The north wind blows at 70 km/h, carrying ice crystals that cut exposed skin like shards. Snow seeps in, through cracks, broken windows and bullet holes, accumulating in corners as if nature itself wanted to bury Kolm alive. Inside the shelters, the silence is broken only by the chattering of teeth and the hissing of wood-burning stoves. The men huddle in groups of 4 or 5, body against body, covered by anything that resembles fabric. Torn blankets, coats of dead civilians, even curtains ripped from houses. Human warmth is the only thing that still separates them from death by hypothermia. But sleep doesn't come. At 11:11 p.m., the first sniper shot cuts through the air. The bullet pierces the wooden wall of a stable transformed into an outpost and strikes Obergefreiter Heinrich Lenz right in the middle of his forehead as he lights a cigarette. His body falls without a sound. His comrades don't even dare to retrieve him. They know the sniper is expecting exactly that. Half an hour later, a 6-man Soviet patrol appears out of nowhere in the southern sector. They cut the barbed wire. With silent shears, throw 2 grenades into a house where 12 Germans were sleeping and disappear. The explosion illuminates the street for a second. Pieces of bodies fly through the air, mixed with planks and snow. The survivors emerge screaming, firing into the darkness, wasting precious ammunition against ghosts. At 1:40 a.m., the psychological hell reaches its peak. The speakers start. Mounted on sleds about 800 meters from the German lines, the Soviets turn on powerful amplifiers powered by generators. First comes the music, a melancholy Russian waltz that echoes through the ruins like a lament for the dead. Then, a sweet, calm female voice speaking in perfect German. "Soldiers of the Wehrmacht, you have been abandoned. Your generals have forgotten you. Throw away your weapons. Come to us. We have hot food, bread, tea. We will send you home." The voice repeats itself for hours. In some shelters, men begin to cry softly. A Bavarian corporal, who lost 3 toes to the ice, suddenly gets up and tries to run outside shouting, "Ich will nach Haus!" I want to go home. 2 comrades grab him, knock him down, and tie his hands with bootlaces. He cries like a child until he faints. At 3:05 a.m., another sound joins the nightmare. The noise of shovels hitting the frozen earth, hundreds of shovels. The Soviets are digging approach trenches, meter by meter, under the cover of night. The sound is hypnotic, incessant. Tack, 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 like a clock counting down the remaining minutes. In a basement on Pushkinskaya Street, a Russian girl of about 12 suddenly begins to scream. She saw rats eating the face of a dead soldier leaning against the wall. Her mother covers her mouth, but the scream has already echoed. Minutes later, a mortar shell falls right there. When the dust settles, the basement has become a tomb for 27 people, soldiers and civilians mixed together. At 4:30 a.m., the wind changes direction, bringing a new smell, burnt meat. Someone on the Soviet side is roasting horse. The smell seeps through the cracks and drives the hungry mad. A Saxon soldier begins licking the cold wall, searching for saltpeter as if it were food, when finally, at 9:12 the following morning, a grey light begins to creep across the sky. The men who survived the night emerge from their shelters like ghosts. Grey faces, sunken eyes, beards hardened by ice. Some no longer speak. Others pray aloud without realizing it. Lieutenant Weber, who spent the entire night in the Bell Tower with a campaign phone that never rang, stumbles down and murmurs to no one in particular, "The night won. The night always wins here." And everyone knows that, on that night, Kolm lost something he would never get back. The hope that darkness was merely the absence of light. Now the darkness had teeth, and it bit every night. Hunger, cold, and fear. The siege begins to take its toll. January 31st, 1942, fourth day of total isolation. Hunger arrives even before dawn. It doesn't knock on the door, it bursts in. Men wake up with the feeling that something is devouring them from the inside. Their stomachs no longer ache, they burn. Some feel nauseous just thinking about food. Others have olfactory hallucinations. They swear they smell freshly baked bread, fried sausage, hot coffee. A corporal from Hamburg spends entire minutes sniffing his own coat, convinced that it still carries the aroma of his mother cooking. At 7:30 a.m., Hauptmann Scherer orders the first complete inventory of food since the siege began. The result is read aloud in the basement of the old agricultural cooperative by lamplight. 1,840 kilon of stale bread, most of it already moldy at the edges. 420 cans of canned horse meat, 68 kilon of rancid pork fat, 114 kilon of dried peas, 19 kilon of sugar, 4 bags of rye flour infested with weevils, 11 horses still alive but already destined for slaughter. For 5,500 soldiers and approximately 800 civilians, this means less than 300 grams of food per person per day, and it will decrease further. From that point on, the official ration will be soldier in combat, 125 veg of bread, plus 1 can of meat, plus 1 tablespoon of peas. Injured and civilians, half of that children under 10 years old. What mothers manage to steal from soldiers. The distribution is done under armed guard. Anyone who tries to take more gets hit with a rifle butt. 2 days later, a Russian civilian is shot in the square for trying to steal half a loaf of bread from a sleeping sentry. The body is left on display. 24 hours a day as a warning. Nobody complains. Cold weather, now that's a silent and perfect killer. On the night of February 1st to 2nd, the temperature drops to 48 degrees. Alcohol thermometers explode. The air feels solid. Breathing hurts like inhaling ground glass. Frost forms inside the nostrils and on the eyelashes. Men who go out to relieve themselves return with their faces covered in ice crystals, as if they had been immersed in acid. Frostbite comes in waves. First stage, the skin turns, white and hard. Second, gray and insensitive. Third, black. When it reaches black, it's too late. In the hospital basements, Dr. Ernst Kleist and his 2 assistants work tirelessly. They amputate with a butcher's saw heated over a fire, without anesthesia. The only painkiller is a cloth stuffed in the mouth and a soldier holding the patient down on the floor. The smell of burnt flesh, to cauterize the stumps, mixes with the smell of pus and excrement. In a single night, they amputate 38 toes and 11 fingers. A lieutenant in the 123rd Division, Joachim von Kleist, a distant cousin of the doctor, has both feet black up to his ankles. He asks to be allowed to die with his boots on, like a soldier. Dr. Kleist refuses, sawing off his legs below the knees, while his cousin softly sings the Prussian infantry hymn. He dies during the second leg. Paranoia turns brothers in arms into suspects. On the third night, a sentry fired at a figure approaching. It was a comrade returning from the outside. Bathroom. The body lay stretched out in the snow until dawn, because no one dared to retrieve it in the dark. The next day, the shooter was found hanged in a basement. Suicide or lynching, no one investigated. Russian civilians begin to be seen as a threat. An old woman is caught stealing rotten potatoes from a warehouse. She is beaten to death with shovels. A 14-year-old girl is accused of signaling to the Soviets with a mirror. She is shot by an improvised firing squad. Later, it is discovered that the mirror was just a piece of glass. And then there are those who simply switch off. A Westphalian Obergefreiter is found sitting in a chair, rifle in his lap, eyes open, dead. He has no wounds. He just froze there, watching a window that looked out onto nothing. His body doesn't fall when they push him. It's as rigid as a statue. They use him as a mannequin to scare new recruits. Look what happens if you sleep on duty. On the 5th day, Captain Scherer walks along the lines. His face, so burned by the cold, it looks like a leather mask. He stops at each shelter, shakes each man's hand, looks them in the eye. You are not fighting for Berlin now. You are fighting for one more day of life, and that day is still ours. Some cry, others simply nod, but everyone knows the Russian winter doesn't negotiate. The sky tries to help. The first aerial launches, February 3rd, 1942, 11:18 a.m. The sound arrives first as a distant hum, almost unrecognizable amidst the wind. A sentry in the church steeple shouts in a hoarse voice, "Airmen! German airmen!" In seconds, the entire city is in the streets, looking at the sky as if it were Judgment Day. Faces burned by the frost, sunken eyes, open mouths. Some fall to their knees in the snow. There are 12 Junkers Ju-52s from Transportgeschwader 1 flying at less than 80 meters altitude to avoid heavy anti-aircraft artillery. The wings are covered in ice. The engines cough in the extreme cold. One of them is already emitting black smoke from its left engine. The first containers begin to fall. Some have white parachutes that open like flowers in the grey sky. Others are simply dropped. Burlap sacks hastily sewn together, wooden boxes reinforced with wire. They descend spinning, crash against the snow with a thud, sink halfway down. But the Soviets react in seconds. The 37mm and 76.2-meter anti-aircraft batteries open fire. The sky fills with black balls of explosions. Red tracers rise like swarms of wasps. A Ju-52 is hit in the fuselage. The fabric tears. The crew is seen struggling with the controls. The plane makes a wide turn, loses altitude, and disappears behind the line of trees to the east. Seconds later, a fireball rises on the horizon. No parachutes. Even so, the others continue to quit. Inside Kolm, it's organized chaos. Major Schirmer shouts orders. Recovery teams, North Sector, South Sector, and Central Square. Those who stand still will starve to death. Groups of 20-30 men rush out of the trenches without helmets, without rifles, only with shovels and ropes. They run through the soft, waist-deep snow under machine gun and sniper fire. A container falls right onto the main street. The men surround it like ants. When they open it, it contains 400 kilos of frozen black bread, hard as brick. A soldier starts licking a loaf right there, crying. Another container falls 400 meters beyond the lines in Soviet territory. A dozen Germans run after it. Machine guns open fire. 5 fall before reaching it. The others manage to drag the box back, leaving a red trail in the snow. Inside, 98K ammunition, egg grenades, and, miraculously, 2,000 Coca-Cola chocolate bars. The official drug of the Wehrmacht, caffeine and pure sugar. A young Gefreiter named Fritz Köhler finds a container alone, 250 meters from the lines. He opens it with his bayonet, his hands trembling. Inside, carefully packed, 125,000 scale topographic maps of the Leningrad region. No food, no ammunition, only maps. He sits in the snow, holds a map against his chest, and begins to laugh. A laugh that turns to tears, that turns to screams. 2 comrades drag him back before a sniper finishes him off. In total, 12 planes manage to drop cargo, 7 return. 5 are shot down or disappear. What arrives inside the perimeter? 4,800 kilos of bread, 1,200 kilos of canned meat, 800 kilo fat, 120,000 cartuchos, 7,92 milliliters, 4,000 hand grenades, 800 kilos of medical supplies, bandages, morphine, sulfur drugs, 3 tons of pressed hay for the last horses. Letters, thousands of letters from home. At 5 p.m., Captain Scherer orders an extra ration to be distributed. 250 of bread, plus a spoonful of fat, plus half a bar of chocolate per man. Civilians receive half, but for the first time in days the children stop crying. At night, in the cellars, the men read the letters by the light of tallow candles. A Silesian soldier receives a photograph of his wife with the newborn child he has never seen. He kisses the photograph, holds it to his chest, and weeps silently. Outside, the wind howls again. The temperature drops to 43 degrees. But inside the shelters, for the first time in weeks, there's a warmth that doesn't just come from the body. It comes from the certainty that, out there, someone still remembers them. On the radio, the last message before the battery dies. Iron Ravens, we will return tomorrow. Resist. The Führer knows about Kolm. And for the first time, nobody laughs at the word Führer. Because at that moment, in the midst of the frozen hell, those 12 old bullet-riddled planes were the only proof that the world still existed beyond the red ring of fire. The sky had not yet abandoned them. Not yet. Close-range combat. The city becomes a bloody labyrinth. February 8, 12, 1942. The weak Kholm bled street by street. February 8th, 5:47 a.m. The bombardment begins without warning. It is no longer the distant roar of previous days. Now the Soviet cannons are less than 2 miles away, dragged through the night by tractors and hundreds of soldiers. They are 152mm howitzers from the 507th Heavy Artillery Regiment and 120mm mortars from the 26th Brigade, positioned on the hills to the north and south. The projectiles arrive almost in a straight line, with a short, brutal whistle before impact. Each explosion raises a column of snow, frozen earth, and pieces of houses that no longer existed. In 23 minutes, 1,800 projectiles fall within the perimeter. Bolshaya Street becomes a canyon of craters. The old pottery collapses completely, burying alive an entire platoon of the 7th Company who were sleeping in the basement. When silence returns, the air is so thick with icy dust that it feels like ash is snowing. And then they come. These are no longer the human waves of the early days. Now they are assault groups of 12 to 20 men each, specially trained for urban combat. Sappers from the 84th Engineer Battalion of the Red Army, sailors from the Baltic Fleet with striped jackets under their padded coats, and the feared Sturmoviki of the 249th Siberian Rifle Division. They move in absolute silence, wearing impeccable white camouflage, armed with PPSH-41s, F1 grenades, and trench knives. They enter through the northwest breach, where the barricade from the previous night has been reduced to toothpicks. The first contact is so close that there's no time for fear, only reflex. At the corner of Sadovaya Street and the old cooperative, Gefreiter Willi Koch is crouched behind an overturned refrigerator. He sees a white figure appear 3 meters away. He fires from the hip with his MP-40. The Soviet falls, but another is already on top of him. Koch feels the impact of the rifle butt on his temple. The world spins. The icy ground hits his back. The Russian sailor raises his bayonet for the final blow. At that exact second, Koch's comrade, Hans Stöcker, appears at the basement window and plunges his bayonet into the attacker's neck. Warm blood splatters on Koch's face, the first heat he's felt in weeks. In another house, at number 14 Pushkinskaya Street, the fighting is taking place inside a destroyed kitchen. Oberleutnant Kurt von Seidlitz defends the ground floor with 4 men. The Soviets enter through the back window. The fight lasts 7 minutes and takes place in an area of less than 10 square meters. Furniture flies. A table is split in half by a burst of PPSH ammunition. A German soldier, Herbert Lang, is hit in the abdomen and falls to the ground, trying to hold his guts with both hands. A Siberian steps on him to reach the next one. Seidlitz fires his Walter P-38 pistol at point-blank range, 3 shots into the enemy's chest. The Soviet falls on top of Lang, suffocating him with his own weight. When the smoke clears, only Seidlitz remains standing, his uniform soaked in blood that is not his. In some places, the 2 sides are separated by a 30-centimeter wall. On Sovetskaya Street, house number 27 is occupied by Germans in the basement and attic. The ground floor is no man's land. You can hear the Soviets carrying weapons on the other side of the floor. Someone starts banging on the wall with an axe. The Germans respond by throwing grenades through the stove hole. The explosion opens a hole. Hands and legs fly. For a few seconds, there is silence. Then a voice in Russian from the other side. "Come on, Germans, surrender. You'll die anyway." A German voice replies, hoarse and tired. "Come and get us, Ivans." Sergeant. Major Heinrich Riedel, a man who has become a legend within the pocket, leads the most desperate counterattack of the day. At 2:30 p.m., the Soviets managed to take the entire block between Lenina Street and the Lovat River, almost 180 meters of land. Riedel gathers 28 men, remnants of the 3rd, 5th and 9th companies. There is no time for a plan. He simply shouts, "Throw the grenades, then with the bayonet, forward!" They emerge from the basement like demons. They throw packets of grenades through the windows of the occupied houses. The explosions are so close that shrapnel hits the attackers themselves. Then they go house by house. The fighting is medieval. Bayonets, trench shovels, rifle butts, teeth. A German soldier, Franz Meyer, kills a Soviet officer with a broken chair. Another, Karl Becker, is stabbed 17 times and still manages to crawl to the street before dying. At number 42 Lenina Street, the situation reaches an absurd level. Germans in the basement, Soviets on the first floor. The internal staircase is destroyed. Both sides decide to use explosives simultaneously. 2 charges detonate seconds apart. The entire building rises half a meter off the ground and collapses, burying 31 men at once. 19 Germans, 12 Soviets. When the surviving Germans dig out, they find only arms and legs protruding from the rubble. A still living Soviet lieutenant is pulled out. Both his legs are crushed. Before dying, he looks at Riedel and says in perfect German, "You are crazy." All this crazy. At 5:12 p.m., the Soviet attack lost momentum. They managed to advance 220 meters in some places, but paid a terrible price, more than 800 dead and wounded that day alone. The Germans lost 187 men, almost 4% of the entire garrison. The city is now a labyrinth of death. Bodies are piled up in doorways, hanging from windows, seated in chairs as if still on guard. The snow is so compacted and mixed with blood that it has become a pinkish-grey paste that clings to boots like glue. Weapons freeze in the hands of the dead, fingers still curled on the triggers. In some places, the bodies are used as part of the barricades. They freeze quickly and serve as shields. At night, the smell is unbearable. Burnt gunpowder, torn flesh, feces of the dead who emptied themselves upon dying frozen urine. The rats have already begun their feast. Major Schirmer walks along the lines as night falls. He passes a soldier sitting against a wall, head bowed. He touches his shoulder to encourage him. The body falls to the side, dead for hours, held up only by a crust of ice. In a basement, a young Austrian soldier is found crying. They ask what happened. He points to the corner. There lies the body of his older brother, decapitated by shrapnel. The boy holds the head in his arms as if it were a sleeping child. When darkness finally falls, the silence is worse than the gunfire, because now the Soviets are 40, 50 meters from the German lines in some places. You can hear them coughing, carrying wounded soldiers, cursing under their breath. You can smell their campfires. Kolm has shrunk once more. The perimeter is now an irregular horseshoe shape, just over a kilometer in diameter. Every street is a front, every house is a fortress, every window is an arrow slit, every cellar may be the last thing a man sees in his life. And everyone knows that wasn't the worst day. The worst was yet to come. Because now the enemy was no longer on the other side of the forest. I was inside, the city, breathing the same icy air, waiting for the next sunrise to finish the job. Ruins, delirium, and determination. Kolm on the brink of collapse. The days following the hand-to-hand combat leave Kolm unrecognizable. The city, already small and poor, now resembles a cemetery of wood, bricks, and black snow. Houses that sheltered families for generations are nothing more than twisted skeletons. Streets that were once narrow have transformed into corridors of rubble where the wind howls. Like a hungry animal. But what is crumbling fastest is not the buildings, It is the men themselves. Hunger reaches unbearable levels. Soldiers spend hours arguing over crumbs. Some lick empty cans to get the slightest taste of grease. Some civilians start boiling old boot leather to make a bitter, thick and nutrient-deficient soup, but at least it tricks the stomach for a few hours. The cold, as always, continues its silent massacre. During a short patrol, 3 men don't return. 2 of them are found frozen, kneeling behind a barricade, as if praying. The 3rd is found the following morning, buried in the snow, his eyes open and crystallized. But perhaps the worst thing is what you can't see. The minds of men are breaking down. There are soldiers who start talking to themselves, murmuring conversations with people who aren't there. Others laugh for no reason, a dry, humorless laugh. A corporal insists he saw his wife walking in the middle of the city, calling his name. He tried to run after her and was almost shot by a Soviet sniper. Doctors try to help, but how can they help if they themselves are at their limit? Captain Scherer realizes the danger. If morale falls, Kolm falls with it. So, even exhausted, he does something that no military manual teaches. He walks, street by street, soldier by soldier, shelter by shelter. He doesn't give long speeches or make empty promises. He simply holds one shoulder, looks into their eyes, and speaks a few words. "You're still." "Here, me too, let's keep going." And strangely enough, it works. Sometimes all a man surrounded needs is to know he's not alone in that white hell. But the situation continues to deteriorate. Soviet artillery fire intensifies. Bombs fall randomly, scattering snowdrifts and debris everywhere. A projectile hits a house where civilians were sheltering. When the soldiers arrive, they find only silence and floating dust. The church bell, once used for warnings, collapses after a direct impact. The metallic sound echoes through the city like a death sentence. Ammunition supplies are also running low. There are groups that engage in combat with only 15 cartridges each. If you miss a shot, there's no replacement. And then comes the final blow. One of the radios stops working after being hit by shrapnel. It's another link severed with the outside world. The siege closes in emotionally as much as physically. But it is at this moment, in this pit of utter despair, that something changes. Within the defenders, they realize they have already overcome the impossible many times. They are still breathing, those who still hold their weapons. That Kholm, against all logic, still resists. And this notion creates a different kind of force, a force that is born not from hope, but from the brutal stubbornness of someone who refused to die when they should have already fallen. Deep down, every man understands. If the siege aims to break them, it will have to try much harder. The final, silence over Kolm, the shadow that remained. When the ice finally began to give way, and the German lines managed to reopen a narrow corridor to Kolm, the scene they encountered seemed not to belong to the world of the living. There were no shouts of celebration, no hurried steps toward freedom. The men who emerged from the ruins looked like ghosts, sunken eyes, ashen skin, some leaning on pieces of wood, others carried by comrades who barely had the strength for themselves. The Kolm pocket, the place so often cited in military reports as an example of heroic resistance, now showed its true face. A silent expanse of charred houses, makeshift trenches, artillery craters, and bodies buried under dirty snow. The wind, once freezing, now blew weakly, stirring up dust from broken bricks and tattered flags that had once marked defensive positions. The surviving soldiers walked slowly out of the frozen hell, but none of them were sure they were really getting out. Many barely recognized their own names. Others had lost their speech. There were those who, upon seeing the rescue troops, simply collapsed, not from relief, but because their bodies finally understood that they no longer needed to fight. Among the wreckage, doctors found frozen diaries, unsent letters, weapons jammed by the ice, and small amulets that the soldiers kept to remember them home. None of it brought peace. It only reinforced the brutal contrast between the life they had and the death that nearly swallowed them whole. For the German High Command, Kolm quickly became a symbol. propaganda posters appeared extolling the heroic fortress and the invincible spirit of the defenders. But the men who survived knew the truth. There was no heroism, only the desperate struggle of human beings reduced to the extreme limit, holding their positions because there was nowhere else to go. For the Red Army, the memory of Kolm was a proud wound, a battle that cost blood and time, a testament to the relentless harshness of the Eastern Front. Many Soviets who fought there carried with them forever the regret, the trauma, and the certainty that the war had no winners, only survivors. When spring arrived and the snow melted, Kolm revealed all that winter had concealed. Bodies, once frozen, emerged from the muddy ground. Weapons embedded in the earth reappeared like fossils of a recent past. And the once vibrant village became a silent memorial, a stark warning that war does not forgive and never forgets. In the end, the siege didn't end. It merely became a memory, a cold, heavy, eternal memory. In the end, Kholm was not just a siege, it was a cruel test, an extreme test of what a human being can endure when everything around them crumbles, when the cold cuts like blades, when hunger growls louder than machine guns, when every second becomes a silent battle against one's own mind. The men who resisted in that small, forgotten spot on the map didn't win a trophy, didn't raise flags, didn't celebrate victories. They simply survived, and in that frozen hell, surviving was such a great feat that it still seems impossible today. Kolm has become a grim reminder that war isn't just about vast battles and famous names. Sometimes it's decided by tiny groups of exhausted soldiers, hidden among ruins, fighting alone against the impossible. There, in the icy heart of Russia, a handful of men held the line long enough for history to continue, but paid a price that no book will ever be able to fully explain. The siege is over, but Kolm never ended up inside them. The snow melted, the bodies were buried, the reports were filed away, and the world moved on. But those who lived through that terror carried with them invisible scars, memories that only the profound cold can awaken. Kolm became a whisper in the wind of history, a harsh, melancholic whisper laden with courage and suffering. And even today, when someone revisits this story, they don't see glory, they seethe. Struggle of human beings pushed to their absolute limits, confronting death every day, knowing that no one would come to save them, and yet not giving up. Kolm showed the world that sometimes the impossible is not overcome by force, but by the desperate stubbornness to keep breathing, and that is why the siege should not have been survived. He survived, but never forgotten.